Hi everyone, I'm Mr. Smith. It's Friday, and today we're looking at subtracting in Georgian Გამოკლება. Გამოკლება, of course, is, for example, 2 minus 1 equals 1, but also we're going to look at other things that are aspects of this part of arithmetic too. So, if you're ready, let's go. So let's begin with my Instagram poster, and at the top we've got გამოკლება, and this is the act of subtracting, and we're looking at basic arithmetic, questions like 2 minus 1 equals 1. In Georgian, ors minus erti udris erts, showing us also the direction of our question in our mind, but definitely paralleling what's written on the paper. 2 minus 1 equals 1. Ors minus erti udris erts. But pause for a second. Think about when we say in English, taken away. So we would actually say 1 taken away from 2 equals 1. We would write it like this, exactly this way. But as we orally say, 1 subtracted from 2 equals 1. We've moved the numbers in our head because we've used a verb that's more complex than simply minus. So in Georgian, we've got another alternative, გამოკლებული, which will give us the pure idea of subtraction, because minus is also used in another way. So if I were to say 1 minus 2 equals negative 1, and that's quite important because, again, in English, we don't say negative 1. We would naturally say minus 1. So we find on one hand, it's quite useful that minus and minus are the same. But again, it can appear a little bit awkward. And so just remember that erts minus ori udris minus erts. So we've repeated that word there. And so just so that we can be aware of the movement in our head, and that it is actually rather interesting to see how definitive the Georgian construct is. If you've already seen lesson 50 about mimat'eba, which was about adding things up, then we're going to start to get a much more familiar connection as we go along with how Georgian mathematics, especially basic arithmetic, actually is quite conceivable for us. Especially in this case, with something subtracted from simply flipping the order, despite the fact that we would write it that way. I know we don't often think about it that way, but it is at the core of understanding the structure in Georgian and the dative-nominative relationship between what's really going on with the numbers and what verb is enacting on what number, and so on. So let's take a look at some examples to clarify my points. Slide 1 is a flashback from last week, where we were able to use da, which means and, to say 2 and 2 equals 4. It was rather simple because da, as it isn't a verbal adjective or a verb, enacts no change on either of our numbers. Now, when we minus in Georgian, we must be aware that the opening number is in the dative case. There really is no way to avoid it. Indeed, let's look at the opening example, which was the one from the poster. Ors minus erti udris erts. Remember what we did about 2 seconds ago. It's 1 minused from 2. It's not 2 minused from 1, despite how we might write it. So 1 minused from 2 shows us the direction, really, if this were a verb. But of course, like we said last week, we want to take these in as a whole. So, ors minus erti, part A. Udris erts, part B. That's our answer. In the second example, it's the same equation, but we're using aris instead of udris, because that doesn't need a dative ending, giving us a simplified form. So, ors minus erti, aris erti, and here even shorter, ors minus erti, ertia. Pay attention to these endings, because we could even say ori, da ori, ortchia, and we would have an even simpler equation from last week, and this is how we would write it. Ori, da ori, ortchia. And so, just so we can see here that those endings are readable and usable, and we should try to put them into practice because it does help us combine the numbers and the either nominative or dative choice that we have. Slide 2, now we're substituting the word minus for გამოკლებული, and we're looking at all three of the available outcomes, because of course part A doesn't change much. So, ats გამოკლებული 1 უდრის 9-ს. Ats 10, გამოკლებული 1 უდრის 9-ს. One thing I wanted to show here, of course, is that ati is the number, but declined to ats because it ends in a consonant, whereas 9 is 9-ს. No change because it ends in a vowel. These things are to be taken into account at all times. So why not with mathematics too? This is another example. We know now from the previous slide that ats გამოკლებული 3 არის 7. Ats გამოკლებული 3 7-ია, taking this er ending. The next, of course, is with tolia. It is using aris, but using the noun toli, which is equal to. It is the equal of. So, at გამოკლებული 1 tolia 9-ს. At გამოკლებული 1 tolia 9-ს. Option 1, option 2, and option 3. Slide 3, just for practice, let's look at 9 minus 2 tolia 7-ს. 9 minus 2 tolia 7-ს. What I would like us to consider here in the genitive construction is that we could bounce back to create orally the equal of 7 is 2 minus from 9. 7 tolia is 9 minus 2. So we can see here that orally we might indeed conceive the numbers in our head, and with the use of the genitive we can see that flow rather completely. Let's look at another one. 7 minus 3 არის 4. 7 minus 3 4-ია. 7, or indeed 3 minus from 7, is 4. 4-ია. And here now we've got a dative construction, and I think that's really one of the progress I want us to make, is that although we've tried to look at simplified forms from an English language perspective, there's actually nothing less simple than a pure dative question. Ats გამოკლებული 1 უდრის 9-ს. Start with the dative, end with the dative, and I think it's rather easy. It also brings to your attention that all numbers need to be put into the brunva, and so that 2, for example, could be displayed like this, but it must be displayed also like this, because each different brunva, each different case, applies also to numbers, and we would even write them in this way too, if required. Our final slide, and now we're using a noun, which is lari. And we're using the dative construction, and of course the nominative changes, especially with a number before. So asilari becomes aslars. The number loses all endings, it's in its root. And then lari gets an S, the same as otchmotsi becomes otchmots lars. Dative. What's important here, of course, is we're going to talk about percentages. So, otsi, 20, procenti, 20%. And look at how we might say it. 20% of 100 lari equals 80 lari. 20% minus from, taken away from, 100 lari equals 80 lari. So we can see how we construct it orally and how we construct it here symbolically. One thing, if you remember, maybe like 7 or 8 months ago, I did this video, which was all about how to construct large multiple numbers. So we must see that 80 is 80. It is 4 20s. That makes me think. Okay, but that's 4 20s becomes 80. Similarly, if we're going to use 70, which is going to be our second example, then it's going to be samotsi, which is 3 20s, da plus 10. Really, that's how it's constructed in Georgian. Remember that, so it's just a little reminder of what we've already studied, giving us then aslars minus. Yeah, aslars minus. 80% udris 80 lars. In this case, aslars გამოკლებული 80% samotstati laria. Here we're using the verb to be. Aslars გამოკლებული 80, 30, because that's simply 20 plus 10, percent, samotstati laria, shown here symbolically. These will be the most complicated questions that we have done today, but please take into account all of the variables. You can really decide which of the two you find easier. The final one I thought would be just because we use the word katsi to say people, persons, coming into an event perhaps. So there may be 100 people at the wedding. We're trying to feed how many people? It would be asikatsi. Although you don't have to be a man to be in this particular group noun. So, but we're doing it very concretely. We're going to say that there are, in fact, 100 men, and 30 men subtracted from 100 men is 70 men. So, of course, our number loses its ending, and katsi takes a dative. So, as kats გამოკლებული 80 katsi udris samotstāt kats. That's how we're going to construct it. But just remember, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking always about men. If you read the news or listen to some gastronomic television shows and they talk about how many people are coming to the party, how many people are coming to the supra, then they might use katsi as a universal number just to mean person. That's it. That's the last slide of today. Next week, we're going to be looking at Gamrავლება, which is multiplication. So have a nice weekend and I'll see you then. Bye.